Okay, I think I'm recording. Does it say you're recording up there anywhere? Oh, yes, it does say.
Yeah, it says it's recording on my side.
All right, great. Hi, my name is David Haldeman, and I'm with Humanities Washington. We are a statewide nonprofit dedicated to opening minds and bridging divides by creating spaces to explore different perspectives. We are doing a series right now called Rebuilding Democracy, which is about democracy and civic engagement and the state thereof. And we're very excited today to talk to Jevin West. Jevin is an associate professor at the iSchool at the University of Washington and the director of the university's Center for an Informed Public. Also, Jevin created a class that went viral. The class was called Calling Bullshit. And you were co-created that class, correct? With Carl Bergstrom?
Yeah, co-created with Carl Bergstrom, who's another professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Washington.
Nice. It was essentially about misinformation, and we thought you'd be a perfect person to talk to about how sort of the state of misinformation and how it is affecting civic participation, democracy, and civic engagement. So I guess I kind of wanted to start by asking you how you became interested in devoting your life to the study of disinformation.
Absolutely. And first of all, I just want to thank Humanities Washington for all the great work you're doing. I think it's one of the more important things we can do when it comes to this issue of misinformation and disinformation, to talk about how we can come together again and treat each other as humans and to have nuance in our conversation, as we were discussing even before we started recording here. But I got interested partly because I was seeing these issues both in my personal life, like we all have seen, this rise of misinformation, quote unquote fake news, the increase in clickbait we see everywhere, and the sort of pollutedness of our social media feeds all the time and in our news headlines. But it was also I was also seeing it in my professional life as a researcher in the world of science and in the social sciences, seeing an increase in the misinterpretation of research that was being done, but also some issues in science itself. Even though I'm the biggest fan of science, always have been since I was a small kid, but seeing the need to help students and the public better understand how science is done and to deal with this other mode of communication that we see all the time, which is data. Data is everywhere. It comes in graphics and statistics and numbers and fancy technology language. And we really wanted to essentially bring what humanists and the humanities have been doing for the students and public for millennia, to bring the questioning of and the interrogation and the rhetoric, sort of training that we give to students, and bring that into discussions of data. And so partly because there's all sorts of misinformation out there, but there's a particular kind that Carl and I get kind of annoyed by, and it's what I teach all the time, which is the misinformation that comes wrapped in data. So if you see a statistic that says 45% of every podcast is has no value or something. Well, where does that 45% come from? How did they calculate? What's the denominator there? How do you asking questions, which is what we do in the humanities. And so that's what certainly brought my interest to it. But then, of course, 2016 hit with this real rise of misinformation coming from all sorts of different venues, coming from, of course, bad state actors. We certainly saw those effects, or at least we saw what was happening, at least during that election. But it was obviously happening before, and it's not just one country. It was happening from lots of countries. But also we saw the rise of bots. We saw the rise of algorithmic curation that was built, sort of essentially creating these kind of echo chambers. And then also we just see increased politicization and this polarization of any topic that lands in our social media feeds. And so so it was a rise of lots of things. And then I realized, then my colleagues and I, who have been thinking about it for quite some time, we said, this is probably the most important thing we can work on. And so, with Carl, we built a class and we wrote a book about it. And then we also created this center with my colleagues, Kate Starberg and Emma Spiro and Chris Coward and Ryan Kalo. And really now it's what I spend most of my time. And it can be exhausting too. When you study misinformation and disinformation, holy cow, you kind of need to really take a break at the end of the day and take a walk with humans and with people in person, because it can be exhausting. So yeah. So anyway, that's how I got here. Long-winded answer for saying that it's a part of everything that we touch in the information world, and it's something that we have to address. And I think the civic engagement, which you're working on, is really, I think, where we could make some progress.
Nice. I actually want to pick up on the personal experience of dealing all day with misinformation a little bit later. But something I kind of wanted to ask up front is misinformation genuinely worse now than it has been in decades or even centuries past? And I guess I'm asking that question because, you know, it used to be a couple centuries ago, you may live in a small village, you may be subject to rumor and speculation, and you had less science, you had less data on what was happening around you. You know, these days we hear about misinformation becoming this giant problem where it's able to travel very quickly. But are we genuinely surrounded more now with a greater degree of misinformation, or is it just that we're able to sort of, it's become, because of social media, simply able to travel farther?
Yeah, it's a great question. And first of all, it's really hard to measure what misinformation or how much misinformation is out there. We're having lots of discussions about this among researchers that spend a lot of time on this topic. And trying to figure out a metric has been a nice exercise, but we haven't solved it yet. So I would say, you know, come back maybe in 10 years and we might have figured out a way to measure misinformation. But I think if you asked me just for a quick answer, I'd say I do think it is worse, but it certainly doesn't mean that there wasn't misinformation and rumors, conspiracy theories in times past, because absolutely it has, since the dawn of human communication. And were times when there were gatekeepers that could control the information even more. And possibly you could make an argument that maybe they were able to manipulate more those that were in control of the information channels, whether it was the clergy or, you know, the kings and queens or whoever was in power at the time. They may have been able to control information more because there was you know, truly gatekeepers. Whereas now, you know, anyone can be a gatekeeper, anyone can be an editor, a producer and consumer of this information. It's that it does pass so fast. And I think that is the difference. It's the speed in which information can travel. And it's also the ways in which we can scale it if we want to manipulate. So there was manipulation before when you had, you know, a small set of individuals that could control the narrative at a particular time and the information that was coming out about science or about policy or whatever was happening during these previous times. But you can do that now if you can deploy an army of bots. You can, you know, if you're sophisticated enough technology wise, or if you have enough funding, there are ways in which you can also manipulate at scale. But it's also that as someone that, let's say I'm a person that wants to manipulate opinion and I want to, you know, push misinformation out. It doesn't require me to own a print subscription, to have established a bunch of followers in a newspaper that I, you know, bought. There's an investment there. It took time to gather that audience. Now I can jump on, sign up for a new account on Twitter. If I'm sophisticated enough, I can send out messages, gain influence using a lot of the tricks of the trade that's used in the misinformation space. And I can get things to go really fast. In fact, we could have a whole lesson on that. I'm not going to do that because I don't think that's what we want to do, is teach people how to do that. Although some people say, well, Jevin, why don't you just fight fire with fire and push, you know, the good messages through those techniques? And there's an argument there possibly, but I think we should have that discussion about whether we should do that. That said, I do think it is. I think we are contending with more misinformation right now. It's been the Wild West of social media, and now they're finally coming to the table and talking to the public more because they're being forced to. They're doing a little bit more. The public's recognizing a little bit more. Governments, for better or for worse, are recognizing that too. So I do think we can get through this stage like we have in other jumps in information technology. But if you said, okay, just give me your quick response. My quick response, I do think we're contending with more misinformation now, because everything we live in an information world, an information economy, and it's easily infiltrated by misinformation.
So what are some of the biggest sort of sources of misinformation? I mean, I know that clearly, like, there's a lot of social media is often blamed, but who are the sort of, where's the majority of misinformation coming from?
Well, I'll say that the majority of misinformation that's spread is us, and a lot of times unknowingly. So if you look at a lot of the research that's been done in this space, and we have a lot coming out of our own center and in other research institutions around the world, what you find is there certainly are bad actors. There are people like, for example, the high school students in Balis, Macedonia in the 2016 election, where we're pushing out fake news. They didn't care whether Trump won or Clinton won at that time. They just were getting clicks and making a ton of money. They were making, some of them were making $100,000 a year when the average salary in that town was $5,000 for a high schooler. That's 20 times the average salary. This is amazing, just to make up a news. They had the most shared fake news story of the time, which was Pope endorsed Trump, and it got,
which I fell for. I absolutely fell for. I clicked.
Yeah, so many people did. Well, that came out of the factories creating fake news, which they're still doing. So there are groups and individuals that are creating fake news. We'll call it fake news for now. We usually just say misinformation because there's money to be made. There are some that are pushing propaganda. And then there are some bad state actors that are just pushing misinformation to cause divisiveness, to make people start to distrust any of the institutions in which we rely. And that's problematic. But ultimately, it comes down to us sharing it. So when we say who's ultimately responsible for at least moving it around the space, it's us. And so that's why we need to pause, think more, share less, we always say in our center, because we're the ones sharing it. Now, that said, if we look back at a recent event, so the recent US 2020 election, we just put out a report through our, we called it the Election Integrity Partnership. It was a nonpartisan group in collaboration with Stanford University and a couple other labs where we were working in real time trying to monitor misinformation around that election, not about whether Biden said this or Trump said that, but really watching for misinformation around participation interference, procedural interference, fraud, delegitimization. And our report, we just put it out a couple of weeks ago. It's a 250-page report and that explains all of our analysis. The main take home is that the real drivers of at least the 2020 election, when you compare it to the 2016 election, these were verified accounts, which was different. They were they were kind of hidden accounts. People weren't sort of showing their true self, and there was bots and et cetera, et cetera. This 2020, these were verified blue check accounts. And there were really, truly what we call repeat offenders. These are high influencers on social media that were really the ones responsible for the majority of misinformation around the election. And in that case, one of the responses could be to go kind of have some consequences for these high influence accounts that were continually repeat offending and responsible for a lot of the spread. And actually social media companies for the first time ever, and actually they did point to some of the work we were doing saying there's like a 3 strikes, you're out, or 4 strikes, where it's increasingly more punitive as you continue to violate their rules of pushing misinformation. So at least, it's constantly changing and evolving, the landscape. These bad state actors and bad actors more generally will evolve their methods. And there have been differences, but at least when it comes down to the most recent election, these were individuals that weren't hiding behind any fake account. These were individuals that are high influence on social media and were pushing. So they were responsible for pushing and picking up narratives and then, within some frame and then, pushing them. And so in that case, it was mostly, a small number. But I'll just end again saying we're responsible for spreading a lot of it because we share it. And we need to, stop that as much as we can.
Was there any data, or not to ask you to speculate too much, but so how did this affect voting? How did it affect civic engagement? And to kind of build off that a little bit, something that always mystified me a little bit is that, Trump said for months before the actual election that the election was rigged, that essentially it would be fake, that there was going to be bad actors, et cetera, which to my mind strategically didn't make a lot of sense, because you'd figure like if you were just claiming the election was rigged, then the people who believe you are going to say it doesn't matter, then my vote doesn't matter. So from your perspective and from what you've seen, how does disinformation generally affect civic engagement and voter turnout? do you kind of go, oh, I don't believe anything, so I'm not going to go vote? Is it motivating for people? Does some misinformation motivate people to go vote? And how did it affect the 2020 election? I know that's a lot. But...
No, it's a lot, and they're all great questions. And first, I will say, in much of it, I will be speculating because there's a lot of research going on about the actual effects of that. So what we've done is just describe the kind of misinformation that was passing through the 13 different major social media platforms and the kinds of tactics that were used. We didn't get into what the effect might have been on voting, and others are working on that now. But I'll speculate a little bit because it's an interesting enough question. I'll first start with saying that a lot of the tactics of the earliest papers describing disinformation. So these are from even the Cold War times when countries, and Russia gets pointed out because they kind of have been one of the architects. I mean, US has been involved to some degree to these kinds of things too. But the goal of disinformation is to generate apathy, really, and also distrust for all institutions and ourselves, and trust in ourselves. And so I do think those kinds of tactics do likely have an effect. Again, I haven't shown that in my research, and I can't point to anything yet because it's too soon to say, at least for the 2020 election. But I would say your hypothesis that it can disenfranchise voters and make them be less inclined to go in and vote if they think it's just a totally rigged system, that has to, I would imagine, have negative effects on people's voting behavior. And I think it very well may have had an impact on that. I will say that this buildup before the election, and certainly on election day and then after election, really pushing arguments of delegitimization and voting fraud certainly had to have had some effect on January 6th too, because most of the people there believed it was truly rigged without really, at least acknowledging all the court cases that were done by a lot of the individuals that were even appointed by that administration. And I just think more generally for democracy, this is an issue that, and you saw this all coming from a lot of Republicans too, being concerned about these arguments about voter fraud and delegitimization. That affects everyone. And even some Republicans themselves have been concerned that affected their vote in Georgia. So yes, I do think that when you claim fraud without much evidence, if any evidence. By the way, there are examples of fraud in any election, but when you look at how small a percentage that is, and that's been investigated for decades, that's not something that goes unnoticed. But it's such a small, tiny percentage that if you don't have greater evidence of true fraud, it can be quite damaging for democracy itself. And that hurts both parties. That hurts all of us. So in sum, I would say that, yes, I do think that it likely could have had an effect. People are studying that right now. All we know at this point are the things that were said and the tactics that were used. And so now we can use what we've learned from that to now start to start to ask the questions that you've asked, David, about did that affect people's voting behavior? And I think it'll be an important thing for the public to listen to when that research has been done. And it'll be hopefully done by many different groups, so it's independently confirmed or deconfirmed. I don't know, but I think it's a really serious issue.
Yeah. So a lot of the focus about misinformation has been devoted, and for understandable reasons, toward the right, because you had, Trump was not exactly known for, he could bend the truth at times. But I also wanted to ask a little bit about misinformation on the left. So what are you seeing from the sort of left side of the political spectrum in the US? Is it as big of an issue as it has been on the right? Or is one party a bit more concerning to you at this moment?
Right. So one person, a researcher that's looking into this really well, just came and gave us this great talk in our center. He's at University of North Carolina, his name's Dean Freelon, and he is just really taking this particular issue very seriously, about saying that yes, there is a lot of misinformation, of course, on the right. And actually, if you look at our report for the Election Integrity Partnership that I just referenced, a lot of that was from the political right when it comes to misinformation on election, but it wasn't all. There was misinformation, at least from the left, around, for example, efforts, to claim that the lines were too long or that there was issues at voting booths, claiming that people were being disenfranchised. And what that does is then that could also discourage voting, or that the mailbox were sealed when in fact we have one post where a mailbox was sealed a long time ago. It was just decommissioned by the United States Postal Service, but it was being cherry picked. And so there are examples of those. Again, it was at least when it comes to the 2020 election, it was more on the right. And it's not that you would expect equal in everything. I mean, there's sometimes issues where it's more on the left. For example, the left has had issues with vaccination misinformation. And we see that in the state of Washington in particular, even before the pandemic hit. We were seeing rises in measles, and that was a concern before even the pandemic. And so I think there are issues both from the left and the right. But one thing that I mentioned, Dean Freelon, who's a professor at UNC, has been looking into that more and trying to really to make sure that we're not making this a one-sided issue. And actually, in our class, because it's, we really take a nonpartisan stance, when we get examples from, let's say, the right media, we also pull things from the left, trying to balance it. Not to say that there's an equivalence, that there can be a misbalance, but what we need to do as educators is make sure that people, on both sides of the political party don't think that they're immune to misinformation. Yeah. We're all susceptible. Even people like myself who teach classes on misinformation and write books on it. I am not immune to this. And so we got to be careful not to go too far down that route. And also because it's you're not going to make much progress if you're just pointing fingers in one direction. And so we need to look internally. In fact, one of my favorite quotes was from this really famous sociologist back in the 1940s who was talking, 1950s, I suppose, was talking about this. He was, one of his third laws of kind of BS calling was to make sure that we call BS on ourselves as well. I mean, he says it more eloquently, but I don't want to try to make it verbatim when I'll just get it wrong. But the main point was sometimes the biggest BS that we need to watch out for is ourselves. And so I think we need to be doing that to make sure that we, to show that this is something that we're all susceptible to.
That makes sense. I wanted to ask you about solutions. And there's so much conversation right now about everything from holding the tech companies more accountable to government intervention, to removing Section 230 or revoking it or altering it. From your perspective, what do we do? Where is the bulk of the action needed to come from?
I think one of the most important things we can do is engage with each other in good old fashioned one-on-one discussions or actual public square kinds of discussion in the real world, and try to move ourselves sometimes from the vitriol that we see on social media and the scoring of points that we talked about before this recording. And I'm a huge advocate of education, and I know that media literacy isn't the panacea. It's not the only thing, but one of the better things that we can do is engage students and the public in helping them understand the kinds of tactics that are used to manipulate us. So I'm a huge advocate of education. Certainly there is technology policy that people are throwing around right now. And actually we talk about it in our center. It's one of our pillars. We have 4 main pillars: research, community engagement, education, and policy. And Ryan Kalo is sort of spearheading that. And we're going to have some discussions. We've had already some discussions in the center around Section 230. It's interesting. Section 230 is it's one of those rare bipartisan kinds of efforts, but they come, both the political left and political right come at it for totally different reasons. But Section 230 will be revisited. Who knows? It may be revoked and rebuilt. There are some concerns even about that too. It's a sticky subject, and I'm happy to go into that in more detail. But I will say that there's nothing that Section 230 is going to do that's going to fix this problem fully. It can address it. I do think that technology companies should be forced to the regulatory table. I've wanted that for a long time, even though, that in itself isn't a solution. So you can throw a law at it. You can, technology companies say, oh, we'll solve it. They've got, we got it taken care of. That I for sure don't have trust in. They may change some design things. They may create the banners now that they have, and they might hire fact checkers. And And those things are good. I think that's movement in the right direction. And they did make some changes during the pandemic that were in the right direction. I have to give them credit where credit's due. And I even think during the election, there were some things that were good. Not all things were good. And in fact, some things I would think they may have gone too far. So I think those are all things there. It's all going to be in concert, hopefully. But if I had to choose one thing, it would improve civic engagement, civic discourse again, online, offline, and most importantly, to spend more on education and more investment, of all of us into engaging students, engaging the public around these issues, so they can be a part of that discussion. They can be at the table, and to let democracy work when it comes to this particular issue. So to me, it's education, community engagement, or where I think really the intervention is.
Yeah. Is there kind of a generation gap between susceptibility to misinformation? And I'm asking because there's a sort of stereotype out there of the sort of older, boomer who grew up with Walter Cronkite, or, 2 or 3 news sources that were more or less reliable, or at least had a lot of fact checkers. Then suddenly they start to see news items come across their screen, and to them, screens often gave truth, or had the implicit stamp of some degree of truth. Is there any credence to a generation gap with susceptibility to misinformation?
Partially. There's been mixed research that has come out on it. So there was a research study that came out of NYU a year or 2 ago from Josh Tucker's team, who I know, and they do good research. And they did find that there was a difference when it comes to the amount of misinformation, or the type of misinformation that's shared between different demographic groups. And the older people over 65 were sometimes a little more susceptible, not being digital natives. Maybe, like you said, that screen sort of, it seems, almost carries truthiness with it. And that, I think there are some issues there. And actually, we're engaging with like ARP and with people in that age group around some trainings. We actually are talking about a fact check ambassador program. So they'll be the ambassadors for their own groups. And it's been a lot of fun working with them. But there's also some research that show that that's not necessarily the case. I mean, part of a lot of the issue is just in critical reasoning. And a lot of students in the younger age group, for example, are still struggling between what's a fact piece and what's an opinion piece. And that's disturbing, I think, because, it's to be expected as students and younger generation starts to read more primary literature and reads, more news items, then maybe they're not as acquainted to things like that. But that's so basic. And that was, there's a group at Stanford, the Stanford History Group, that does a lot of this work. And they find that we have as many challenges with the younger generation and all generations, really, to be honest. We think it's a K1 through K99 problem. Yeah. But that the older generation, it could be, that they are good and not good at certain different things. So maybe it's the older generation that's good, a little bit better critical reasoning skills. They've been around longer. They're retired engineers and business owners and teachers and librarians, et cetera. They can do the critical reasoning, but they need to do more what's called horizontal reading. So instead of just staying and trying to use all their critical reasoning skills, trying to dissect an individual article, they need to go into a new tab in their browser and move across like fact checkers do, and then try to corroborate and see what other sources are saying. But maybe the younger generation, which does maybe a little bit more tabular reading, but needs to, we need to teach them a little bit more about those basic critical reasoning skills for dissecting whether something is really a causal claim versus a correlative claim, whether it sounds too good to be true, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's going to require nuance and customization for these different demographic groups. But research is still being done on that, and we'll, regardless of the research, we should just engage as much as we can with these different groups and try to customize the educational content for these different groups.
Cool. I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned toward the beginning, which is the personal effects of digging into misinformation all day. Has it affected your perception of reality? Are there certain checks you have to put in place? I don't know. Can you talk about that a little bit? I sometimes have come across very brief moments of misinformation, and it feels genuinely disorienting. And you just start thinking, God, is this true? So yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
It is. I'm so glad you asked this question. It's a topic that we've been discussing more and more in the center because we have students that work with this content every day. We work with it every day. It's a topic that's in front of us all the time, and it can lower your view of humanity sometimes when you go into these dark corners of the internet and you see these conversations happening. You know, we've been tracking a lot of the work or a lot of the rise of QAnon for several years, way before it was, certainly even before it was even Pizzagate back in 2016. And then we see this accelerative rise, and it is disorienting. And we have students that really are disturbed and question things differently. And so it goes to show how this content can affect people if they get stuck in these ruts and these dark corners. So what we've started to do in the center is we're creating some policies, and actually this is becoming a national policy with other research labs that are doing this. There's a group called First Draft that's also going to be coming out in a week or so with their statement on this. But it's really, really important that we address the mental health part of this. If you're a researcher or a fact checker or a journalist, or even just someone in the public that's engaging with this content, because you might have a family member that's a part of this QAnon group, or a family member or a neighbor that's really engaged in some conspiracy theory about some topic, that we want to help people address their friends and neighbors about this. We want to help people individually that get caught in those. We want to help researchers that are dealing with this content, because it can be depressing sometimes. I think for me, I've seen so many great things happen too, so it makes me overall positive, and I have to take breaks and walk away from it as well. And I don't even engage in as much as some of our students and my colleagues that do some of this even more than I do. But I am seeing so many good efforts at all levels of education institutions and communities and nonprofits. And I see us, I do see us making progress in this area, but we have to address this mental health issue of it, because it can weigh on you and be disorienting, as you say.
Do you start to see, do you start to see sort of mainstream journalism occasionally through the lens of the disinformation that you see? In other words, it's almost like your muscles of sort of skepticism, maybe are working in overdrive. Is
Yes.
that whatever happens, though, that you open, the New York Times or something, and you're just like, is that really true? Or how has that affected you?
Yeah, because, and actually I see this when talking to students sometimes, even in like middle school students, the comment that disturbs me the most is when they say, well, I don't believe anything. They're skeptical of everyone, any institution. I'm like, no, that's not what we want. But then I see it sometimes in myself. I like, because you're all talking about and training the public to be skeptical in what they say, but sometimes it can go in overdrive, and then you don't know what to believe, because you don't believe anything. You feel like this could be another example of them, trying to manipulate in some way, or breaking a lot of these rules that we have when we train people to look for spotting BS out there. So yes, it can be. And so, I think in the end, like a lot of times we'll end class, like let's say when we're talking about some of even the issues in science, we'll start class where we'll say, here's the thing. We're going to talk about some of the things that might be wrong with science, but science is one of the most amazing human inventions of all time, and it still works despite some of these issues we're going to talk about. Then we end class by saying, despite some of those things we talked about, and this could apply to society more broadly in our information environments, that despite these problems, democracy still does and can work. It has some growing pains right now, but that you can trust in, experts. They don't get it right all the time, but you still want to trust your doctors about whether to take a vaccination or not, or to trust experts that do research on coronaviruses or something. We have to have trust in someone, because we can't be experts in everything. So at some point, we need to check our skepticism to some degree, and what that trade-off is depends on the topic and the person and everything else. But that only comes from practicing. Just like it's a skill that needs to be pushed and prodded sometimes, but to pull back sometimes, and have trust in each other at some point too. So yeah, it's a tough one to figure out what that balance is.
Well, that seems like I want to be mindful of your time. It's about almost 12:20. So that seems like a good, mostly optimistic note to end on. But I just want to say thank you so much for this. We really appreciate your time. This was fascinating. Hopefully, like maybe we can talk again at some point. And yeah, thank you.
Well, David, let's talk again. I'm so excited about what you're trying to do, and all of the Humanities Washington group. It's such an important thing to figure out how we can heal democracy, how we can increase civic engagement online and offline. And happy to talk about this absolutely anytime. In fact, you and others should come and visit us in the center once we get to go on campus again, which is getting closer and closer. I'm so excited to be on campus again.
That would be a like a party for us. So we would love to go and join you.
Let's do it. Well, we're going to have sessions open to the public where we can do panels and discussions around this, and we'll have a space where we can do these things. So let's do that. Thank you so much for hosting us, and we'll talk again very soon.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Jevin.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.